And we are back in the Ways and Means room, though we have not left, but the internet did temporarily. And so we are back live. It is still February 5th. And we are continuing testimony on some of the assumptions grounding a foundation formula that's being proposed by the Agency of Education. Floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education.
Jill Briggs Campbell, Interim Deputy Secretary, and we're joined by our consulting team from APA. We've spent a lot of quality time with Justin Silverstein and Amanda Brown.
And if you two could introduce yourselves for the record so you don't need to do it later, that would be great.
Great. Justin Silverstein with APA Consulting.
Amanda Brown, also with APA for the record.
Thanks.
So the focus of this presentation is to follow up on our overview of the funding formula that we provided last week. We captured some of the main questions that came up through this committee and others and put together a very brief slide presentation to walk through those questions and be able to unpack in more detail the data behind this. We know that specifically there were questions.
Oh, sorry, y'all.
And just, yep, I was just wrong
presentation.
power.
We'll pull that
I
out.
have 5 open, so.
But we know specifically there were questions around how the overall spending as part of this proposal compares to our current spending, and then what this would look like in terms of CTE funding and how the adjustments are built in for scale of our system, specifically around the small school adjustments. So we have put together some slides to walk through with some additional data tables. I believe it was posted to your website yesterday afternoon. Hopefully you have access to that.
I have a fairly specific question while Jill is bringing things up.
Tap dancing?
The CTE, there's like a CTE little circle flowchart arrow thing.
Yes.
And I'm curious what the plan, we have a lot of CTE students who attend CTE part-time and the school
Yes.
part-time. What's the plan there?
We'll talk about that too. So there's adjustments built in contemplating that in terms of if they're full-time or part-time. So we'll allow Justin to walk through that as part of the proposal. That visual is really helping to understand there's a shared responsibility for the student from the sending school to the tech center. So we'll be able to extrapolate that in our conversation today. I also understand that you probably have other questions. So this is designed to be a pretty quick presentation to walk through what we heard were some of the biggest areas of inquiry and then open it up to capture additional questions you might have to be able to make sure we furnish you those answers. No. Yeah, that's a. No. So I'll let, so Amanda and Justin, if you could walk through, we'll start by just kind of giving an overview. I think as we talk about the scale adjustments is really the first part of the presentation and some of the decisions that were made in terms of smoothing that out. We have received questions around how we've done this modeling. So the modeling that's put in forward is really contemplating fiscal year 28 and assuming that all of the components of this proposal would be implemented in full. It does assume that we would continue to have costs related to our existing portfolio and that in future state, there would be additional considerations for what schools are small by necessity and what schools are small by choice. And so we'll kind of walk through those assumptions that are baked in. I just mention that because we recognize that this is a multi-phased approach. And so the modeling is assuming that we won't be at optimum scale or efficiency in our system in the fiscal year 28 timeframe. And we've accounted for that. We'll also walk through some additional assumptions that we've made in terms of what we think would be increases in terms of transportation, categorical, and things of that nature.
I did find it.
So now
So if we're exploring, if you're proposing that you're fully accounting for the existing school buildings and school portfolio in fiscal year 28, and we're fully funding those, what incentives will be in place to change that portfolio?
Right. So while there's an assumption that we would maintain those schools, there's also an assumption in place that we would change delivery and staffing within the funding available.
What does that mean?
So with the assumptions built into the foundation formula include scale class size. So we've identified from K to 3, a 1 to 15 student ratio, and in the upper grades at 1 to 24. So we know that many of our schools aren't operating with those class sizes, so there would need to be some adjustments made to that. Additionally, as we walk through this.
Right, when you say adjustments made to that, do you mean adjustments made to the funding that's delivered or adjustments made to the experience of
The operations.
schools?
The delivery.
And that would happen before 26.
The idea would be to start putting that into place in fiscal year 27.
Okay.
So that this next year becomes an informational year where we're able to share more details around the funding. And in doing that, be able to identify what districts and support may need some more of an accelerated plan and support. As we've mentioned, as an agency, we've supported a number of districts that have needed some stabilization efforts, right? And so this is there would be some work happening to make sure that in this transition, those are supported, and there may be decisions on an earlier scale that they may need to make around, maybe combining grades to achieve that class size or sharing resources before the full districts are in place.
And so I'm trying to like build out a 5-year plan and visualize a 5-year plan in my head well enough to explain it to someone who's
Understood.
not like living in boring math land. So I love boring math land, but not, the public doesn't necessarily. So in fiscal year 26, we might have different class sizes that's built into the formula, but we would have our existing number of buildings and schools that's built into the formula. But we're hoping, I hear that you saying that you're hoping that we would have a different portfolio in the future once more consolidation happens.
Can we, yeah, I'm sorry.
What incentives would be in place between 26 and say 30 if we're fully funding existing practice in 26?
So I think that's been a big part of it.
It's like a philosophical question more than a modeling question, I think.
Right. So one, I think with this plan that is establishing within policy, what are those measures for education quality and financial solvency? And so there's a measurement of that and an identification if they're not able to deliver that range of services that are expected, that there are options for those districts to be able to, or schools and districts to be able to meet that. And so part of the planning in this transition and what we would be having conversations with you about is being concrete around that criteria, so that we can be supportive of getting schools into a position to be able to do that. We know right now that schools of the same size operate their classes differently and operate their buildings differently. And part of the support we would be providing along the way is support with budgeting. So we've brought on some additional resources to help in that regard, and also helping to facilitate some of that sharing that may be needed in order to get to that future state.
And if I can add, so, and we'll talk about this a little bit further down in the presentation. So we have an acknowledgement that we're in a multi-year transformation, right? So there was real intentionality here that when we talk about moving to a foundation formula and switching governance in FY28, so that July 1, 2027 is when those two moves would happen, but that we're going to need additional time to rescale our school buildings, right? Because there's a lot that goes into that conversation. And so we didn't want to set up right from day one districts at a sort of a disadvantage in having still the same portfolio of schools, but not enough funding to support. So that's where that's built in. And as Amanda will explain when she talks about this, the weights for a school that is small exist in the funding formula. The policy decision is what we've distinguished as small by necessity versus small by choice. We're saying that July 1 of 2027, we're not making that distinction for the existing portfolio, but that, to your question about the incentive, that at a certain point, the state will need to make some policy decisions about what qualifies a school as small by necessity. They would receive those weights. And then at a certain point, the state is saying, if you're small by choice, the state is not going to, you will not be eligible for those weights. The weights still exist, but the eligibility for them would change.
And so I think what I'm trying to understand in my sort of original question is when you say at some point the state will have to decide, are we putting the framework for the state to decide
Yes.
upfront?
Yes.
Everyone knows that that's
Yes.
going to become law, that's going to become practice in 5 years. Okay, that's because we're in this balancing act between, there's a lot of incentive for transformation right now, and that incentive is painful for a lot of people. And so this is a moment to act. It's also, nothing is going to happen overnight. And so making sure that we're not, there are an extraordinary, and Representative Holcomb is very eloquent about this. There's an extraordinary number of perverse incentives, and I mean that in the mathematical
Yes.
systems way, not in the regular English way. Perverse incentives built into this system. And we want to make sure we're not just adding even more.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
And I think within the policy proposal, and what we would want to get concrete on this session would be the criteria. And actually, we're hearing from the field how important that would be, because there is a lot of work that's already underway to kind of move directionally towards where we're headed. And those parameters would be quite helpful to support that work.
And I think this is part of what Secretary Saunders was saying, that FY '26 becomes the year where folks know where we're heading, right? They have that information available to them. This will be the class size minimums, so schools can start to make some choices. This will be the criteria for small by necessity versus small by choice, and this is the timeline by which to achieve. And then all of that sort of on the ground work, right? There's a lot of consideration around sort of the local context that needs to happen. And we need to also scope out how the state will be supporting that transition over time. And so that's what that fiscal year '26 is about, is this is the direction that we're going in. So to your point, yeah, we do need to signal that direction so that folks know where they're heading.
And I'm struggling right now with not knowing if things are synonyms or not. So like scoping and signaling are different from putting into law, so people know what to expect in an environment where people are feeling very stressed and want to know what to expect.
Understood.
Okay.
So the intention is to be as transparent and concrete as possible this year, signaling what those expectations and parameters are, and allowing for the 2-year ramp to move in that direction. The other piece that we'd like to bring forward, if it would be interest to the committee, is really looking at some of the budgeting choices that could be made when you look at a district of this size with, you know, some of the same set of needs, because there are incentives kind of built in naturally around how do you really develop a robust district, and thinking strategically on a larger scale around how to make those decisions, because there are choices that can be made to continue to operate smaller schools. There are choices to be made to expand programming in middle and high school. What we built within the funding formula is really an assurance that research is saying this is a very generous amount, and we've kind of modeled what could be provided with this funding. But there will be, beyond those parameters we established, some flexibility with how districts choose to invest dollars. And there are some incentives just naturally built in to thinking about, well, how do we make these choices to really strengthen the overall district, which is now kind of really considering a lot of diverse needs of multiple communities.
And I think those practical examples will be very, very helpful for the field. I don't know if it makes the most sense for us to be going through them or education be going through them. I'll talk to Peter about it.
Okay.
Thank you for preparing them. I think Representative Holcomb, you had a
I have one
question, and then let's go into.
I just want to understand the clarification question, something you said, and I'll wait for my size questions till after you have a chance to present. So Rose, we haven't let you start, but just
We had a little delay.
But just to be clear, you're saying, are we signaling that our desired class size is 25 and 26? Or are we funding with the assumption of class sizes of 25 and 26?
So the 26-27 school year.
Okay. So 1 year out, not for the ones that the budgets
Correct.
will be voted on in March.
Correct. So,
Trying to figure out
yeah,
when
correct.
that
So
assumption-
25-26
That's a very big
school.
difference.
Yeah,
Yes,
25-26 school year is really considered an informational year. Part of the reason that governor is suggesting we buy down the property taxes is to allow us to have that stabilization for next year, so we can be future focused on how we get ourselves into shape for 27, 28, 28, 29 and beyond.
So you're, in effect, then the buy down is your estimation of the gap between actual current cost and what you would like us to be spending.
the buy down is related to the increase in the property taxes based on the estimates from the December 1 letter.
The same thing. It's the gap between.
There's a
what you're
gap to
proposing
getting there.
fund and what you think districts actually need to spend.
And then we're going to support through that informational year of being able to show this would be the dollars available within the foundation formula. The 26-27 year would still have some sort of stabilization year, but we're expecting some of these cost containment strategies to begin being put into place before we would move into the 27-28.
So instead of funding a transition off of a graduated foundation plan, you're funding a transition off of a general fund transfer or something to buy down the tax rate.
We're-
interim years.
So we're funding the transition years to stabilize the effort before a lot of the adjustments can be made into the system. And part of what we're also working on in the field is really thinking intentionally around how do you make that a smooth transition? I think we all know that this work is really big work, and we're trying to develop this on an accelerated timeline while also making sure that we're doing it well and the right way. And so there's a parallel path that we're developing at the agency around understanding the type of support that we need to be providing in the field. Within the governor's proposed budget, there is no additional dollars for this next year to help build the agency's capacity to that end and supporting that work.
Representative Burkhardt, and then
I have so many questions about assumptions and I tried to ask them last time. I wonder, can we see the model, like the actual model? I mean, I think in spreadsheets that helps me to like work through details and then be able to pull back and understand what I'm looking. Can we just see the model?
Can I ask a question? Just simply a procedural question. The model, all of the spreadsheets, all of that is, we've shared with JFO, and my assumption was that was how it would be sent out to committees as they needed that information.
that's generally not how we can figure that all out, sort of the logistics of
Yeah.
that.
So we have all that.
That's a great use of committee time. So I
I
think
had access to that, and that's something that we can make available.
I think we want to understand, I think JFO wants to understand how the spreadsheets work before they talk us through before they talk to us about the spreadsheets. And so if your team would like to explain to us how the spreadsheets work
Okay.
before that, we can do that. I also know you have some tables in here that certainly I have some questions about. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Okay, so we can start with these high level tables, but what I'm hearing is it might be helpful to just do a deep dive of kind of the Excel file and the model that's built in line by line for this group. Not everyone wants that, so that's great.
For the nerd committee.
Okay, I love it. I love it. Okay, so I outlined some of the common questions we heard. We understand that you have more questions, so we want to be able to note those today and respond. And with that, I'll turn it over to Justin. He'll do a brief recap, and then we'll get through some of the data charts we put together.
Great. Yeah, just very high level, grounding us again, the different components, base funding at 13.2, economically disadvantaged weight at 0.75, EL count at 1.5, CTE funding a combination of on behalf payment coming out of that base, plus a 1.3 weight for CTE center students. We'll talk more about that on the slide. Triple E, we mentioned a couple times, it is still that tax capacity weight, and we haven't done a deeper dive there. Similar with the district sparsity weights, size adjustments that are applied are similar to what is in the current formula, which are tax capacity, but built through resources and applied very differently. And Amanda's going to walk through the slide there. That gets us to our total funding through the foundation. The additional, we have categorical still in a number of places. A couple of things we want to highlight is looking at increasing the special education categorical by that, what we think is kind of the difference between what is paid for by the federal and the current census block and what was raised through the district budgets. Not saying that would be permanent. I think we've talked about this before, right? Really goal is to get the efficiencies and the right programming for special ed and likely reduce cost over time, but don't want the districts to start on the back foot and not have enough funding. Very similar with transportation, going from the 50% reimbursement to basically full reimbursement, but with the assumption that there could be some cost savings. And Jill, we're now looking at your
Email.
Your
Will
email.
somebody answer my emails for me?
Justin, while we don't have the PowerPoint up, two quick questions. One, are you imagining that that the census block grants would be increased by that amount per student?
I think that is our assumption right here. And so yes. I
Okay.
mean, is that the,
Great.
Yeah.
And then I thought I remembered your weights being additive, not multiplicative. Did I remember that wrong?
they are additive.
And why do you have
Well, it's the base times each of these separately. So perhaps not the best layout.
0.5 plus.
So are you asking if a student who is free and reduced lunch is also getting the EL weight? Is that
Well,
what?
I assume that they are, of course.
Yeah.
But would you, if, say, a student had the EL weight and was economically disadvantaged, would you be multiplying that count of those students by 2.25 or by 1.5 times 0.75?
So each of these weights is applied separately in its own box. As we walk through the Excel spreadsheet, we can show that. So it's 1.5, if you're an EL student and let's say an economically disadvantaged student, you are going to get 0.75 times 13,200, which is 9,900. Then you're also going to get 1.5 times 13,200, and you'd get the 13,200. So everything would be additive. It's not multiplicative.
Thank you. I think it's just a layout,
Yeah.
Yep.
letter choice thing. Okay.
Perfect.
Can I just ask two quick questions about your weighted long-term ADM? I noticed that you don't have any weights for grade level. And could you just explain the rationale for that?
Yeah. So in the EB model, so there's kind of two things. So one, in the EB model, the higher cost is actually at the elementary grades. And so if we were to apply one, it would be at the elementary grades, not at middle and high school, which you have today. So partly just a different philosophy. But more importantly here, the assumption is in the new governance structure that you have all K through 12 districts. So you have no non-operating, you have no just elementary or just high school districts. And so you don't need to make that adjustment because you have the full spread. You could absolutely unpack that and put that in, but for our assumptions were with those K-12 districts, you wouldn't need it.
And actually, I had three questions, but the other one was you don't have pre-kindergarten up here.
Yeah, and that could just be an oversight. They are basically at just a full-time 1.0 at this point.
So that would be in addition to what's here. And then why are you applying sparsity at the district level and not at the school of enrollment?
It is the same, the district sparsity adjustment is the same as what we are applying, what's being applied today. So it's running the exact same way.
But it's applied to schools.
I understand that. What I'm at, well, except it might not be, right? Because
It's
you're
applied
giving
to
the weight.
districts.
It's
You're
applied to
giving the
districts.
weight to the district, but the reality is they might be all attending very, very large schools.
Yeah. So again, I think this is one of the places, and it's in the policy brief, we think should be addressed and re-examined. So we are keeping it in right now, but I definitely think, especially as the governance gets shifted, this is a good thing to take a look at.
The students that the district sparsity weight is applied to, how are those students counted?
It's applied to the district level student count. So the
every-
district sparsity is district level. Yes, it would apply to every student in that district. The school ones are only to the students in those schools. So yes, to your point, it is
Any difference?
sitting in two different places. Yeah.
Okay. And then what year are these numbers?
So the base is based on 24 school year 24-25 figures.
Okay, and you have the categoricals broken out by student instead of by district. Is that how you're planning on applying them?
The categoricals are by district.
Okay, that's not,
Illustrative, I think is what it was meant to.
It was just illustrating the additional amount of funding that would be generated is on average 840 per student.
So I think for this particular group, we need to be able to follow up and make sure that you're able to see the through line in terms of the actual numbers and making sure we're clarifying how that's applied. So I think this is absolutely developed as kind of a general overview and recap of the components. And I'm recognizing from our conversations that it's the deeper dive that we need to provide for you.
Yes.
Wait,
Okay, so let's go to the next
wait, I
slide.
think Representative Holcomb has one more question on this slide.
Perfect.
On the special education, you've increased by 70 million. I presume that corresponds to the current extraordinary expenditures, which have to come off the top of the ed fund somehow and be pushed back into districts. Have you done any analysis of whether that is, there are, how would I say this? There are regional differences in how those costs are driven and whether that's actually an appropriate way to handle this? And also in that vein, we moved to a census block as a way to contain costs when people had significant capacity to raise on the tax side, which is not the case with the foundation formula. So I wondered why you didn't weight special education.
I think this is an assumption of carrying some costs until we're able to achieve those best practices. So I know as a parallel path, we're developing an approach to provide that training to the field around special education. I think we can acknowledge that this Act 173 wasn't implemented as, or wasn't fully implemented as designed. And so we would expect that there's some improvements that can be made in terms of how we're delivering special education to achieve those goals. But my understanding is this is an example of where we're assuming that it's going to take longer time for the system to be kind of reaching that optimal level, and there's some carrying the cost. But Justin, I'll let you.
And I just wanted to clarify that the 70 million is the delta between current special education expenditures and available revenue sources for special education. So it's not in just the excess costs. So just wanted to clarify, it's really the delta of what's being spent in local budget decisions beyond what's funded through both the census block, any other available state special education dollars and federal special education dollars. But I think it's a very good question and discussion for the policy of how do you want to approach this tension between right now your districts are spending 70 million more on special education than they have funding for, and this idea that you are trying to cut special education costs over time. So in part, we left the census approach recognizing that that was the goal of the census approach. But I think it's a conversation. Do you leave it here? Do you think about doing it a different way?
Yeah, I think in the context of previous weighting conversations, there was real debate about the appropriateness of weighting special ed or not. And it was, I think if we had had a foundation formula at that time,
Right.
the conversation would have been to actually weight special ed. And it was really only a block, an unweighted block grant because of the ability to raise extra revenue.
We also had, we had that conversation. There are states that have, multiple levels of weighting for different students. What we're sort of acknowledging is what Secretary Saunders said, which is we have to actually do some work on educational delivery. And this would be something we would want to come back to, right? So again, multi-year transformation.
One more detail as we're diving into sort of the flow chart for the detail people. Having the numbers not be FY24 numbers, but actually the numbers that we're talking about implementing would be helpful because no one's talking about implementing FY24 numbers. We're talking about implementing FY26 or 27 numbers.
So 28.
Or 27, 28. So
I thought these were FY 25 numbers. Amanda, can you confirm for me?
They're FY25.
okay.
13 too. Yes.
Correct.
It would also really help me when you speak, if you could not use we or be specific when you use we, who we is. Because some of these things, I mean, when I think of special education, this to me is an argument that underscores the need for the BOCES, the Boards of Cooperative Education Services, because when you're in that extraordinary, category, that's actually not something they solve on their own. And so I guess a question back to you is, what are you planning to do this year around implementation of BOCES to get a handle on that number? Because that is growing faster than I've ever seen it grow.
Yeah, so we are absolutely contemplating BOCES as part of the future state and the existing state. And I think special education and CTE are definitely areas where we're seeing that being of need to manage that for sure.
Are you keeping extraordinary special education as a totally separate line item that's separate from this? Or are you including that in that 70?
That's
what the 70 is? Okay, thank you. We're ready for the next slide.
Page 2.
You're doing great.
5 minutes was maybe a little ambitious.
You all have wonderful questions, so we very much appreciate it. So this, again, the question was coming up, just how does the size adjustment work? We gave a little bit of background on the theory of action of how we got there, looking at how does the EB model work at different size points? How does that compare to what was in your current system? And then recommending weights that were similar at certain size points to what you have now, but really changing the implementation to both eliminate funding cliffs. You know, if you had currently 99 students versus 101 students, you'd get a very different weight in the system. So we created a formula that really smooths that curve. And then a couple other pieces is that it runs, instead of just adjusting under 250 students like the current system, it goes all the way down to the 450 that's assumed in the base. So recognizing that you're going to have additional costs in that band of 250 to 450 students that you want to pick up. And then to what we've touched on earlier in the presentation, starting that this would apply to all schools at the beginning and then to necessarily small schools once those criteria are set in the future. So you can see if you look at the chart to the left, what that looks like when you apply, or sorry, chart to the right, my bad. That size adjustment formula to different school enrollments, you can see the additional dollars that it would generate. And so, yep.
Is it the model, the original EB model that you tweaked had different assumptions for school sizes at different grades? How does your new weight?
Yep, no, that's a great question. So the elementary and middle
How did you,
school.
what is, and sorry, I'm just gonna, just so I don't have to cut you off the second time.
Sure.
The second half of my question is, how did you actually adjust the weight? What math did you use?
So if you look to the policy brief, that'll show the different size points that we looked at for the evidence-based model. To your first part of your question, the EB model does assume 450 at elementary and middle school, and high school is 600. When we looked at how you might apply those resources at different points, the delta between the 450 high school and the 600 high school was only about 1% different. So we were comfortable using the 450 as the floor for all, even though that high school is a little larger. So then I'm not sure I quite follow the question of how, so then we took those points and you can see 450 would be no adjustment at about 200, you're about a little shy of 0.15, a little shy of 0.25 when you're at 100, and applied a curve to that. Just the computer generates the curve, and you can see how well that curve fits to those points. And it fits with kind of what we know about school finance research, that costs increase on this kind of reverse J curve, where it starts low and then kicks up the smaller you get.
And
Page 15 of the report has more of that detail around the.
Yeah. Thanks, Jill.
When these numbers, when you're applying these numbers, I imagine you're showing us rounded numbers in the table. Are they rounded when you apply them? These are the kinds of questions when we start actually modeling this out on like an impact scale and colleagues start looking at it and the field starts talking to all of their members. It's helpful to understand that kind of thing.
Those are rounded numbers that you see in the chart. So they would be applied in their full number, not the rounded number.
Okay. How far out do they go in real life?
So we set the floor as 0, so it does not go below 0. And I would need to get back to you on the top. I think it runs up to, I think it's like a 0.8 or a 0.9 if you had like one student, but I'd have to look back just to confirm that for you.
And Amanda, I'm wondering if the question is, how many decimals out? Is that the question?
How many decimals out? And partly I'm asking because we put these things in statute.
Yeah.
And so putting out 10 decimal points in statute might be a little weird, but if we are sharing numbers like dollar amounts right now that are based on 10 decimal points, they're going to wind up differently than what we put in statute. And people are going to, and we're going to wind up delivering different resources than we promised when we were discussing it. And so while it might seem very nitpicky, I think the actual result will be quite substantive.
And we can take a look. I don't know if there's a convention already. I know in states we've worked, like in Maryland, their convention is you round to 2 decimal points, right? So different states have different conventions if you have one.
Thanks. I just want to make sure that the numbers we're presenting are consistent across the how we use both how we present them and how we use them is consistent. Thank you, Representative Holcomb.
I was just curious if your goal was to prevent cliffs, why you didn't recommend a continuous variable?
It is a continuous variable.
So, but you've got these, but, so it is, or are these just these are just prototypical?
These are
sizes?
just representative.
Okay,
Yeah, this
that's
is
it.
just
Okay.
illustrative, but yeah.
Okay,
No,
I
great
thought you were
clarifying.
specifying school bands here. Okay,
No,
thank you very
no.
much. And did you discuss a small schools grant program as an alternative way to step people into your desired future state?
We have not discussed that.
Thank you.
And then this next table is just illustrating kind of each step of applying the formula. So the first being adjusting for school scale, and then these pieces are additive. Nothing is multiplying across the bands, but you can see the range of the 500 students. If you were a school of 500, that base is that 13,200. But then you can see how that additional money that we identified on the prior slide gets added to. And then the most important column is that statewide average on the right, kind of gives you a sense of, on average, across your state, about how much funding is coming from the school size adjustment, the sparsity from each of the additional student weights, and plus the adjustments to the categoricals that we talked about. And we're showing those adjustments in part because then it's more helpful to compare to your current spend if we try to account for some of that spending on special education and transportation that's coming out of your ed spend funding and not a separate categorical right now. So you can see,
Just ask a follow-up question. Is the nature of your question about how to be more targeted?
Yeah.
When I look at this chart, I really don't want to be nitpicky. I'm really just trying to understand what it's explaining to me. And I fear that I sound nitpicky when that is very much not my intent. It seems like these columns are on a per pupil basis. But say a student couldn't be triple E and CTE because we have about like a 15-year gap between eligibility for those two programs, right?
No, exactly. It's trying to show as an average for the entire state divided by students, but you're exactly right. Triple E does not overlap with CTE at all. So I can see how that is a little confusing how it's laid out, but we're just trying to give you a sense of, if you looked at the average amount that's generated from each of these across the state, what would that add up to? But you're right.
And so when you talk about a statewide average, what is the addition and division that resulted in the average?
So it is taking the amount of funding that's generated from that particular line item divided by your long-term ADM.
Or long-term weighted ADM or a long-term ADM?
Long-term ADM, not weighted.
Okay. So the average just the number of students.
Just the number of students. Just in,
And their
can you explain a little bit?
Right?
Yeah.
Amanda, so it's the students and their characteristics so that we have
So it's, for
We're
example,
describing-
economically disadvantaged. You have about 43% of your students in the state that are eligible for that. If you times your current long-term ADM times your 43%, you get a count of students that are your economically disadvantaged students. If you multiply them by 0.75, yeah, I'm saying that right, you would get a total amount of students multiplied by the base, the total funding that's generated. If you divide that by your long-term ADM, that gives you that $4,306 per every student in your state that comes through that, even though it's generated on other students. Justin, I feel like I'm not explaining it well. So
No, I think this was an attempt to really show a couple things. Like one, and again, I think this is different audiences, and so we'll definitely need to lean in more on the specifics with you all, and you guys get numbers. I think with other audiences, there was this kind of people getting a little stuck on, well, we can't do this at 13,200, and not really understanding, when you start to put in the other demographic changes, that you would get much more per pupil in overall funding. And so I was trying to show two things, which is really focusing on that 20,726 in the kind of the bottom right corner. That's the, amount per pupil when you put in all the school level, district level, and student level demographic differences. That's the average funding per kid. So about 7,500 more than the 13.2. And then also trying to give some, understanding of it's about 20% more if, a student's sitting in a small school. So I think with you all can get into more of the detail on specifics and different, demographics and look at it that way. So we appreciate that. But those were the two things we're really trying to lay out here.
I think part of why it's confusing is because no student would ever get that entire stack. And
it's more that the district would get that stack for every student in their district. So I think that it's less a comparison on the individual student and more the average for a district.
then
if
maybe
they had the
even just
statewide
putting in
characteristics.
what,
Yeah.
then I think being clear on the number of students that this would apply to and just talking about how much each district would get,
That's right.
given the weights, would be a much clearer way for me, and I keep seeing a lot of nodding. That might be an easier way for us to understand this, especially since I think it's really important for folks to understand that this is actually about resources getting to districts, not cash getting to students. And I think that's the big shift from a very strange formula to create tax capacity to resourcing districts in a very deliberative way. And so I think the more we're talking about the amount going to districts and getting clear about that, that would be a little bit easier. And so if you would describe a district and here are the number of EEE students we expect in this district, here are the number of CTE students we expect in this district, this is the number of students living in poverty we expect in this district, and this is the total resources we imagine this district would get, that might be a clearer way for us to get our heads around this.
That makes
That
total
makes
sense.
a lot of sense.
There are charts like that in the big document.
Yes.
So I did my math, I did my arithmetic on all those, trying to make sure it came out right for my district.
I think we're trying to, in that, show multiple things. I think it's important for us to be more granular, so we can certainly.
Yeah, and on page 18, we do have those student characteristics for each of the proposed districts. And then as you go into sort of the next pages, exactly as you said, we're calling out what it would generate for an FY 25, what it would generate.
And when so my intent behind the nitpicking about FY 25 versus FY 26 or 27 is that number will never actually exist, right? And so if we talk about it in the context of FY 25, but we're not going to deliver, we're actually going to deliver an inflated number in FY 27. I want to make sure that Vermonters understand that that's the number we're talking about.
How would we project out proposed students to FY 28 if we don't know the district character?
I imagine you're going to
I think you're
we're inflating.
It's an inflationary,
adjustment for
great,
inflation.
we can do that. It's like,
Mhm.
these students.
What does the asterisk mean?
The asterisk is, and actually, sorry, Justin, did we skip over the CTE? Or it's right after this one. Okay, so that is for kind of illustrative purposes, knowing that districts right now think about how much do they spend on CTE as part of their current spending. We've included it when we show this kind of total average amount that a district would receive for over their total number of students. But CTE, we're actually treating a little differently. So let's go to the next slide, Justin, I think, and explain why the CTE gets an asterisk.
Okay, so here there was the ask. This is the attempt. We'll see if we landed it on kind of showing flow for CTE. And effectively, there's two. And so let me talk about the flow, and then I will definitely talk about the part-time students. So this is for center-based students, and it's every FTE would receive base funding that's going to their sending district, and the CTE weights of 17,000. The 17,000 would go directly to the CTE BOCES. For the sending districts, they would actually have 8,000 of their base funding per FTE going to the BOCES, and then 5,200 remaining with them in order to cover some of those other incurred costs like guidance, guidance, giving them diploma, and then also trying to offset some of the loss of economies of scale as students move from a traditional high school to the CTE center. The FTE is, and as we looked at all this, takes into account a full-time versus a part-time. So you could have, making a number 10, there could be 10 CT, FTE, 5 of those could be full-time students. That would mean that the full 25,000 was going over the full 8,000 on behalf. For a part-time, you could just half those numbers. So it'd be 4,000 on the on behalf and the 8,500 for the CTE weight, because it would be the 1.3 really times a 0.5 times the base.
Is that written down somewhere?
In our CTE policy brief, which is next week.
This is a substantial increased investment in CTE, and will the justification for spending a lot more on CTE per kid be in that brief?
Representative, we will definitely walk through the estimated cost of actual programming is similar, but you're right, the additional cost remaining is an additional investment. So the way we got to the number is actually looking at current expenditures without federal funds at the CTE centers. So the actual expenditure side at the BOCES is similar, but you're absolutely right. And we'll talk about the why there.
So if this number is included in your base spending, presumably there will have to be cuts in other places in the systems to generate these specified revenues and stay within the numbers. Because we still have that 180 million of savings that we're allegedly hitting.
Yeah, and so sorry, can you say what you're thinking a little bit more, so I'm making sure I'm following
Well,
why it's a cut to the system?
We're presuming a total reduction in spending, but within that total reduction, we're allocating proportionally more to CTE. So presumably we're making it up someplace else. That will be specified, I assume, in subsequent presentations.
Gotcha. I think I understand.
And I wondered also, the rationale that you're providing for the 5,200 staying with the district is that having CTE, you say, is reducing scale in the other schools, the high schools. Is that correct?
Correct. That's what we were hearing in the both the Listen and Learn Tour and prior focus groups that we had on CTE around the state. Is there's this tension between sending schools and CTE centers, in that a school has to make a choice to send a kid to a CTE center. Both they're incurring the cost and the tuition of sending that student, but they're also then losing them from the number of students they're providing courses to. And we heard often about if they send 5 students to CTE, they no longer have enough students left to offer a certain course to their remaining students. So in part, it's to offset the costs that they're incurring to support the CTE students themselves, and also recognizing that the more students they send, the less students they have to provide a robust set of offerings at the sending school. So that's what that number is trying to represent.
I think in this number, we will have further conversation. Because part of the competition for funding that we're hearing now is because we're not at that scale. And so I do think there should, and there will be more conversation around what this set aside should look like when we actually think about shared responsibility and what type of services are going to be provided from that sending school. So I think this needs to be part of a fuller conversation. So signaling that some of this work also started before kind of the broader transformation. And so I think what we need to have some discussions around is, what does this look like for a future state? Might there be adjustments as we're really thinking about the scale that we're describing? So I think we should, and we will have more conversation there. But I also think the question that was asked was, in the initial modeling, are the assumptions around the cost for CTE baked in when we're doing the comparison for overall spending within this model compared to our current approach? And I think that it is, but I want confirmation from from Amanda.
They are, and that's why we assigned that's a bit why you see the asterisk on the preceding slide, is because we assigned, even though we're suggesting in the future state the funding go to the CTE BOCES, we know that's not how it happens right now. So we put the the CT funding that we're recommending assigned to the sending district to better compare to current state.
Okay. Thank you. We have to wrap up and go to the floor.
Okay.
Would love to have you back and we could, just get like really nerdy with APA and don't even need the two of you to sit here if you don't want to. So, but hoping we can do that really soon.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.